Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today and know that our online community is a very important part of our community of faith. So thank you for your faithfulness and being here every Sunday morning. Putting together a sermon is not an easy task for me, and doing so gives me an elevated appreciation of those who do so on a regular basis. But this time of preparation has a benefit as well. It has made me more attuned to the gentle nudges that I receive from God each and every day. And it reminds me that God does indeed still speak to us if we make the space to stop and listen. May God find a way to use my spoken words this morning to bring to all of us a message that we need to hear. And so will you pray with me? Creator God, we give you thanks for the gift of another day and for this opportunity to worship together. We ask that you help us to set aside all that is troubling us so that we may be truly open to what you are saying to us today. I humbly ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Nearly 1 year ago, on August 31st, after waiting with hopeful anticipation for nearly 4 months, our congregation learned that we were awarded a clergy renewal grant through the Lilly Endowment, Inc. This is a very competitive award, and while I know at times Pastor Paul had doubts about whether our application would be successful, none of us on the team who supported him had any such uncertainties. The application was very well written, and it seemed to be very unique, one that would stand out from the others. In applying for the grant, Pastor Paul expressed his desire to find renewal of both body and spirit through pilgrimages to his country of birth, South Korea, his country of ancestry, Japan, and ultimately his country of ministry, the USA, seeking insight into how those cultures have formed him. In the past 2.5 months, he has connected with family, visited cultural sites, and climbed mountains. He has stood on holy ground. He has had experiences that defy words. He has grown personally and spiritually. And in the weeks ahead, we look forward to hearing his stories and sharing his excitement. In the meantime, our worship services continued as we embarked on a summer sermon series in which an all-star lineup of guest speakers explored a myriad of perspectives of home. Today, we come to the end of that series. Our lineup of gifted speakers ended last week. Today you have me. So what have we learned about home? And how can we use what we learned to strengthen our relationship with God and to be more committed disciples of Jesus Christ? Recall with me what we heard during these past several weeks. Pastor Ephraim Zavala spoke about the common humanity we share with our siblings from Mexico, which is his country of birth, and how important water is for the people of both nations who live in the desert, something the Israelites also struggled with. We heard about the Samaritan woman who offered Jesus a drink of water and who in turn was offered the living water by Jesus. Jesus is calling us to be welcoming to all, even to those who look differently or think differently than we do. Our very own Stacia Duncan, who has been an outstanding worship coordinator all summer, delivered the message on Pentecost Sunday. We learned that Pentecost was a festival celebrated 50 days after Easter, when people of all tribes and nations returned to Jerusalem for a homecoming to celebrate the harvest. We find home where our native tongue is spoken and where we understand and are understood, each in our own way. Next, we were taken on a nostalgic journey by West District Superintendent Javier Olivares. Who could forget the video he showed us of so many things we grew up with? Well, at least those of us of a certain age. Old movies and TV shows, songs, games, candy, station wagons, old clothing styles, rotary telephones, so many things that have slipped into the past. His faith was birthed and nurtured by family. We have a desire to return to where we came from, to where it all started. God is at the end of the road waiting for us. Reverend Rob Lee gave us a history of the UMOM New Day Center and how it has become a home for those who would otherwise be living on the streets. He was led by God to step out of his comfort zone and to partner with God in ministry, including Vacation Bible School in South Africa. He thought he lacked the skills, but God was right there next to him, guiding him. He reminded us that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Father's Day was a treat for all of us. We proudly welcomed home Pastor Amanda Correa, who preached her first sermon as an ordained United Methodist elder in the church where she was raised and heard her call to ministry. Her involvement with choir and youth group made this place a sanctuary for her and all of us, where God meets us in joy and sorrow. The place that we call church is the home God welcomes us into. Pastor Jerry Haas was with us for 2 Sundays. As he relocated from the Midwest to the desert, he was confronted by the image of God as a migrant God who goes with us wherever we go. To have a sense of home and community, we need to know and love our neighbors. He also talked to us about dementia. We are called to be a community of support to the dementia community and their caregivers. Those in convalescent homes who say, I want to go home, provide us with a reminder of the home that we have in God. Reverend Tina Marie Reese, who works with hospice patients, shared that walking someone home at the end of life is a privilege. We are called to be fully present with loved ones after they reach a point where they can no longer control things around them. Everyone close to a dying person has a need for comfort care. Suffering often reveals unexpected things about ourselves, but we need not fear death. It is but a door between this life and the next. Pastor Mark Lansbury also experienced a homecoming with us. He described home as not only where the heart is, but also where our souls soar. For him, the church was an extension of home. He told stories about how he was running around our previous sanctuary before this one was built. We learned that the sanctuary was constructed in a way that the walls do not connect to the ceiling because God cannot be contained in a building. And I, for one, had never really noticed that before or what the thinking was, but that stuck with me. He discovered the power of community when the ladies of his church brought meals to their home after his father died. When we join in the work of the church, our relationship with God is changed, and we find that there really is no place like home. Frequent moves were a reality for a military family, such as the one that Pastor Gina Pollard grew up in, and it made it hard for her to find a sense of home. She described home as a place where people know and accept you. Relocation requires us to learn the new community's norms and beliefs. Our challenge is to make church more like a family, not just a physical space, but a place where you can be yourself, where you experience comfort, safety, security, where you can be vulnerable to those close to you. Our Wesley director, Heather Corden, described home as a place of intimacy and shared that God dwells within each of us, instilling within us the fruits of the Spirit. Our God loves us just like the Father in the parable of the prodigal son, welcoming us home with open arms. When we accept Christ, we invite God to dwell within us and to be part of us. My eyes were opened to that reality a few years ago during an encounter with my youngest granddaughter. We were talking about Jesus and some of the stories of the Bible when suddenly she asked me where God lives. I was about to give her the standard Sunday school answer, well, up in heaven, when something stopped me. And after a moment's pause, I answered, in your heart, in my heart, and in all of our hearts. Where did that answer come from? I don't know, but I wasn't smart enough to think of it. Did God intervene with a teaching moment for both of us? Isn't the truth of that a comforting thought? That God makes a home within us and is always nearby. Do any of those ideas of home resonate with you? And with all that has been shared, what do I have to offer you this morning? As I thought about Pastor Paul's pilgrimage to explore his ancestral roots, I thought about my own roots and the places and people that have shaped my life. Allow me to share some of that history. Generations ago, my ancestors were a bit like the Israelites fleeing Egypt and starting a new life in the Promised Land. Although they were of German descent, their Promised Land was near the Black Sea in Russia. Many of them settled near Odessa in what is now the Ukraine, a region we have known as a war zone for the last 18 months. The refugees mostly came from German states, where wars, religious strife, and economic hardship prompted so many to look for a different life. They immigrated because Catherine the Great, who was the Russian empress at the time, and just coincidentally a former German princess, promised the immigrants autonomy and free farmland in Russia. For over a century, the colonists were allowed to maintain their German traditions and enjoyed free land and religious freedom. They were grain farmers and a peace-loving people, so it was a good partnership. Russia benefited from the production of food, and the colonists could live in peace. But all things came to an end in 1870s when a new czar came to power, revoking many of the privileges the Germans had. Reforms targeted their schools, use of the German language was discouraged and in some instances outlawed, and most importantly, compulsory military service was instituted. Many immigrated to North America, treasuring their own identity and culture and seeking a new life. They settled throughout the Great Plains, from Canada to Texas, aided by the passage of the Homestead Act, where they were offered 160 acres of free land to anyone who would farm it. All of my grandparents were in this wave of immigration. If you follow the latitude around the globe from the Odessa region to the United States, you will pass through northern South Dakota, where they settled and where I called home for the first 18 years of my life. As I contemplate their journey, I wonder if I would have had the courage to do the same. Unlike the Israelites, there were no reports of them being led by pillars of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Surely some were left behind. One can only imagine a grandparent's goodbye to a grandchild, knowing that they would never see each other again. Making a new life on the plains of South Dakota was not easy. There were very few trees, so they lived in houses made of sod. Everything they ate, they either grew or raised. They worked hard, and when things got especially tough, perhaps they leaned on Isaiah 40, verse 4. Every valley shall be exalted. Every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. We don't always recognize it in the moment, but as we look back on our lives, we see our faithful God at work. Which brings me to our Old Testament scripture. For those of you who follow the lectionary, I can tell you that the scripture I chose this morning goes in a different direction. You'll miss the stories of Jacob wrestling with God all night long and the feeding of the 5,000. But as I read Deuteronomy 31, I saw definite parallels to what my ancestors experienced. You'll recall that Moses, who had led the Israelites in their desert wanderings, was not allowed to enter the Promised Land. It happened because God told him to speak to a rock so that it would send forth water for the Israelites to drink. But he struck the rock instead. Moses followed his own instincts instead of trusting in God, and he paid the price. But even though he was not allowed to enter the Promised Land, Moses promised that God would cross the river ahead of them and remove all obstacles in their path. He urged them to be strong and courageous because God, your God, is going ahead of you. He is right there with you. He won't let you down. He won't leave you. I believe those who came before me were similarly blessed as they headed into uncharted territory. My grandparents settled in a small town in northern South Dakota called Eureka. It was actually the wheat capital of the world from 1887 until 1902, having that distinction because that's where the railroad ended and that's where all the farmers brought their grain to ship to market. The population during my childhood was 1,600. We had one elementary school, which included junior high classrooms and a high school next to it. Up until a few years ago, I could name all my teachers, although I doubt I will be able to do that when I meet back with my class for our 50th reunion this fall. It's where I learned to read and write and play trumpet. It was the scene of my, you gotta be kidding me, athletic career, and I don't mean that in a good way. Our town had 7 churches: Lutheran, Baptist, Catholic, Reformed, Seventh-day Adventist, EUB, which later became the United Methodist Church and sadly has since disaffiliated, and the Congregational Church. The latter church is where I learned to sing, got confirmed, earned my God and Country Award in Boy Scouts, and where I preached my first sermon at an Easter sunrise service during my high school years. The town wasn't exciting, but it was my first home, and my time there was filled with lots of great memories. It became clear that my opportunities for a career were limited, and I knew that it wouldn't be my home forever. 4 days after I graduated from high school, my brother Wally and I loaded up our parents' 1962 Chevrolet Biscayne and headed to Denver with no jobs, no place to live, and probably no more than $100 between us. Although Mom and Dad weren't necessarily on board with the move, I had the excuse of just tagging along with my brother. So if something went wrong, I had an older and wiser sibling to blame. That fall, I entered Yankton College in southeast South Dakota, and for the next 4 years, my home alternated between Denver and Yankton. After graduation from college, I made the move to Arizona, and became a Sun Devil in 1977. One Sunday, I walked through the doors of this church and realized that I had found a church home, one that has remained my church home and such a big part of my life for the last 45 plus years. Which leads me to wonder, how did I end up in Arizona with all of you in this church? Knowing that God has a way of opening doors in our lives, I wonder, was it part of God's plan all along? Was I forging my own path, or was I consciously or subconsciously following God's lead? So I turn back to Psalm 139, verses 1 through 10. You've already heard this passage in the New Revised Standard Version, but hear these words again from the Message. God, investigate my life. I'm an open book to you. Even from a distance, you know what I'm thinking. You know when I leave and when I get back. I'm never out of sight. You know everything I'm going to say before I start the first sentence. I look behind me and you're there. Then up ahead and you're there too. Your reassuring presence, coming and going. This is too much, too wonderful. I can't take it in. Is there any place I can go to avoid your spirit? To be out of your sight? If I climb to the sky, you're there. If I go underground, you're there. If I flew on morning's wings to the far western horizon, you find me in a minute. You're already there waiting. What reassuring words. God has known us from the time we were knit together in our mother's womb, and God will protect us and care for us if we would only follow his lead. What is it that makes me feel at home in this church? The familiarity of the buildings and campus is a part of it, although after all these years, I still don't know where all the light switches are. What makes this church home is all of you and those others who have passed through these doors. You have, with God's help, mentored me in my faith journey. I have experienced the courage of those facing death, as well as those who have shown me how to live. We have learned together in adult education classes. We have heard great preaching and music. We have witnessed baptisms and seen our youth grow up into successful and thoughtful adults. I think back fondly to the mission trips with our youth group to Mexico in the late 90s, where we created a house out of lumber, chicken wire, and stucco within 4 days, and also bonded spiritually. Together, we discovered that we all have spiritual gifts which we can put to use, which we can use to put God's love for the world into action. We visit those in our church family who are ill or grieving or lonely. We let them know we care. We allow God to work in our lives and seek to grow into the people that God created us to be. I started attending Tempe First in 1977 when I was a student at ASU and living close to campus. I was looking for a church home, and honestly, Tempe First was convenient, and the Congregational Church, just a couple blocks north of here, didn't seem to be a good fit. After attending this church for a few years, Kathy and I became parents, and we talked about maybe returning to our roots and giving the Congregational Church a second chance. Our son Carl, who was probably 3 or 4 at the time, and had been a regular in the church nursery for quite a while, overheard our conversation. To our surprise, he told us we could go to any church we wanted to, but he was staying here. This is his church. This is where people knew him. He had made friends in the nursery. It's where people were nice to him when he broke his arm. Out of the mouths of babes. The rest, as they say, is history. This has become and will always be our church home. As a much younger person, I could not possibly have seen my life play out this way. In fact, I recently found a short autobiography I wrote when I was in 3rd grade. Kathy and the boys got a good laugh out of the fact that my aspirations at the time were to grow up and own a 1,000-acre cattle ranch in Montana. The funniest part to me was that I hoped to have a 2-car garage because my growing up family had a garage with room for only 1. My, how things change. God had a different plan. Although Kathy and I both grew up in South Dakota, her connection to the state is much stronger than mine. She finds peace in her soul watching the native grasses moving gently in the wind on the plains of South Dakota. I love the beauty of the desert Southwest, the red rock, the majestic saguaros, and the amazing sunsets. Our concept of home can change, but God's faithfulness remains constant wherever we find home. Our home is wherever God is and wherever God leads us. Although I didn't see it at the time, as I look back on my life, I know now that God was leading me in all that I did. I believe as I was led to this place with all of you to support and be supported, to share, to learn, to pray, to fellowship together, and to put God's love for the world into action. For that I am grateful. May we all be attentive to God's leading. God has made a home for us here at Tempe First. For Pastor Paul, Julie, and family, for all of those of you who may be returning from your summer travels, for all of you that are worshiping with us for the first time, and even for those of you who have been worshiping with us forever, welcome home.